Did you kill Travis Alexander?
I absolutely did not kill Travis Alexander. I had nothing to do with his murder. I didn't harm him in any way.
Jodi Arias. They say a photograph captures a moment in time, freezing it forever. But what if that photograph captured something nobody was ever supposed to see? What if it documented the exact second when passion crossed into territory so dark, so violent, that it would grip an entire nation's attention for years to come? In June 2008, a camera accidentally recorded the unthinkable. Time-stamped images that would become the centerpiece of one of America's most sensational murder trials. And the woman behind it all? A soft-spoken photographer who would sit in a courtroom and tell not one, not two, but three completely different versions of what happened that day. This is the story of how obsession, rejection, and a refusal to let go ended with a camera that recorded everything. A crime scene that told an undeniable story, and a lie that kept changing until there was nowhere left to hide. Jodi Arias and Travis Alexander first crossed paths in September 2006 at a business convention in Las Vegas, Nevada. He was a 29-year-old motivational speaker and devoted member of the Mormon faith, known for his charisma and drive. She was 26, a photographer with striking looks and an easy smile. Friends said the connection between them was instant. Within months, Arias had converted to the Mormon church, and the two began a relationship that seemed, from the outside, like a modern romance story. They traveled together, shared dreams, and documented their lives through countless photographs. But underneath the surface, something darker was taking root. The relationship lasted only a few months before Alexander ended it in June 2007. Yet breaking up didn't mean breaking away. They continued to see each other, maintained contact, and kept a physical relationship going even as Alexander began dating other women. Friends of Alexander started noticing disturbing patterns in Arias's behavior, with Alexander confiding that he believed she was stalking him. She would show up unannounced. She allegedly accessed his email and social media accounts. The chemistry that had once drawn them together had transformed into something suffocating, obsessive. But what happens when someone you once loved becomes someone you fear? And what happens when that fear is ignored? By June 2008, Alexander had moved on. He planned to take a trip to Cancun, Mexico, and he wasn't taking Arias. He had invited another woman instead. For Arias, this rejection appears to have been the breaking point she couldn't accept. On June 2nd, 2008, she rented a vehicle from Budget Rent-A-Car in Redding, California. Then she began a drive that would end in unimaginable violence. What happened on June 4th, 2008, inside Alexander's Mesa, Arizona home was documented in the most disturbing way possible, through photographs accidentally captured by the very camera that Arias would later try to destroy. The images recovered from the memory card showed intimate moments between the two. Pictures of Alexander in the shower, and then photographs that appeared to capture the chaos as the camera was dropped. What those images revealed was incomprehensible. The scene painted a picture of rage that went far beyond a single moment of anger. When police arrived on June 9th, 2008, they discovered Alexander's body in the shower, along with massive amounts of blood throughout the master bathroom. It was clear someone had attempted to clean the scene. The camera was found in the washing machine, along with clothing. But the digital memory couldn't be washed away. Within hours, Arias herself called police, asking about the case, claiming she had only spoken briefly with Alexander that day while driving to Utah to visit someone new she was seeing. How does someone make that phone call, knowing what they've done? What goes through the mind of a person who can express concern for a victim they themselves created? The investigation moved quickly once forensic specialists examined the camera and found those time-stamped photographs. The images placed Arias at the scene during the time of the attack. Her palm print, mixed with Alexander's blood, was found at the scene. The evidence was overwhelming. On July 9th, 2008, her 29th birthday, a grand jury indicted Arias on charges of premeditated murder. She was arrested 6 days later in California. But the story Arias told kept changing like a kaleidoscope, each turn revealing a completely different image. First, she claimed she wasn't there. Then, in a television interview, she said she witnessed 2 intruders attacking Alexander. Finally, years later, she claimed self-defense, saying Alexander had become enraged when she dropped his camera and that she had no choice but to fight back. Which version should anyone believe? And when does a story change so many times that it becomes its own kind of evidence? The trial that began in January 2013 became a media sensation unlike anything the American public had witnessed in years. Cameras in the courtroom broadcast every moment. Arias made the surprising decision to take the witness stand in her own defense and testified for 18 days, describing a relationship she claimed was marked by mistreatment and control. She admitted to ending Alexander's life but maintained it was self-defense. The prosecution presented a different narrative entirely, one of jealousy, rage, and planning. They showed those time-stamped photos. They presented the forensic evidence. They demonstrated that this wasn't a woman defending herself, but someone who had traveled across state lines and committed an act of violence. On May 8, 2013, after 15 hours of deliberation, the jury found Arias guilty of premeditated murder, but sentencing proved more complicated. The jury couldn't reach a unanimous decision on whether she should receive the ultimate punishment. A second penalty phase jury also deadlocked. On April 13, 2015, a judge sentenced Arias to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, at 45 years old, Arias remains incarcerated at Arizona's Perryville State Women's Prison. She continues to maintain her presence through a blog and by selling artwork, claiming the proceeds go toward appealing her conviction. But can art create redemption? Can words written from behind bars ever explain what happened that day in June 2008 when a camera captured the unthinkable? The case remains a haunting examination of obsession, rejection, and the lies people tell both to others and to themselves. Dorothea Puente. Grandmothers bake cookies. They knit sweaters. They spoil their grandchildren and volunteer at church. They wear sensible shoes and read mystery novels in cozy armchairs. They are, by every cultural expectation, symbols of safety, warmth, and care. So what happens when that image, that trust we place in gray hair and glasses, becomes a disguise for something far more sinister? What if the sweet old lady who hosts community meetings and helps the homeless isn't helping them at all, but making them disappear? In Sacramento, California, during the 1980s, a woman in vintage dresses and oversized spectacles turned a charming Victorian boarding house into a graveyard. Her name was Dorothea Puente, and her story is a masterclass in manipulation, deception, and the terrifying ease with which society overlooks the vulnerable. Dorothea Puente was born Dorothea Helen Gray on January 9, 1929, and her early years were marked by instability. She would later craft various versions of her childhood, each one more elaborate than the last, but the reality appears to have been one of hardship and dysfunction. By the time she reached adulthood, she had already begun building the persona that would define her later years, a woman who presented herself as a caretaker, someone who existed to serve others. But underneath that carefully constructed image was a woman driven by something far less noble. By the 1970s, Puente had established herself in Sacramento as someone who ran boarding houses for those on society's margins, the elderly, the homeless, individuals struggling with addiction and mental health challenges. She created a public image of a respectable older matron by wearing vintage clothing and large glasses, and not dyeing her graying hair. She hosted Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. She helped tenants sign up for Social Security benefits. To neighbors and social workers, she appeared to be exactly what she claimed, a compassionate woman dedicating her life to helping those nobody else wanted to help. But how often do we mistake performance for truth? And when someone's entire identity is built on helping the helpless, who questions their motives? The cracks in Dorothea's facade began to show in 1982. In April of that year, her friend and business partner, Ruth Monroe, rented a space in an apartment Puente owned. Shortly after moving in, Monroe passed away from what appeared to be an overdose of codeine and Tylenol. When questioned, Puente explained that Monroe had been depressed. Authorities ruled the passing a self-inflicted act, case closed. But was it really that simple? Just weeks later, 74-year-old Malcolm Mackenzie accused Puente of drugging him and stealing his pension. This time, there was enough proof to charge her. She was found guilty of theft and sentenced to 5 years. Even then, authorities didn't connect the dots. A woman stealing checks was one thing, but eliminating people, that seemed impossible for someone who looked like everybody's grandmother. While serving her sentence, Puente began a correspondence with 77-year-old Everson Gilmouth through a pen pal program. After serving only half her sentence, Puente was released from prison in September 1985, and Gilmouth picked her up. They moved in together. Puente wrote letters to Gilmouth's sister, announcing wedding plans. Everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. In November 1985, Puente hired handyman Ismael Carrasco Flores to build a storage box measuring 6 feet by 30 inches by 30 inches. As payment, she offered him Gilmouth's truck and $800. After completing the box, Flores noticed it had been nailed shut and now weighed approximately 300 pounds. Puente asked for help moving it, and together they left it near a river about an hour from Sacramento. On January 1st, 1986, a fisherman discovered the box along the Sacramento River. Inside was a severely decomposed body wrapped in plastic bags, secured with electrical tape, with mothballs and deodorizers placed inside. The remains wouldn't be identified as Gilmouth's for more than 2 years. Meanwhile, Puente continued cashing his benefit checks and mailing forged letters to his sister, maintaining the illusion that he was alive and well. Back at her boarding house on F Street, Puente continued her routine. She took in more tenants, people whose disappearances wouldn't raise immediate alarms. A taxi driver who regularly picked her up said she claimed to have a room in her home where people passed away all the time. When social workers inquired about missing tenants, Puente would simply shrug and suggest they must have moved on. After all, homeless people and those struggling with addiction often do disappear. Who would question it? The unraveling began on November 11th, 1988, when police arrived at 1426 F Street, asking about 51-year-old Alvaro Montoya. Montoya was developmentally disabled, and his social worker was worried after losing contact with him for weeks. Puente seemed cooperative, even allowing officers to search the property. They noticed disturbed soil in the yard. What they found next would shock Sacramento and the nation. 7 bodies were eventually discovered buried in her yard. The victims included Leona Carpenter, Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, James Gallup, Vera Faye Martin, and Betty Palmer, people who had trusted Puente to care for them in their final years. When the excavation began, Puente wasn't immediately considered a suspect. She used that window to flee to Los Angeles, where she checked into a hotel and eventually went to a bar. There, she struck up a conversation with an elderly man, but he recognized her from television news coverage. He called police, and Puente was arrested. The trial began in 1993, and Puente was charged with 9 counts of ending lives. The proceedings lasted months. After several days of deliberations and a deadlocked jury, due in part to her grandmotherly disposition, Puente was ultimately found responsible for 3 deaths and received back-to-back life sentences. The jury couldn't reach unanimous decisions on the other 6 cases. Throughout the trial, Puente maintained her innocence, insisting that her tenants had all passed from natural causes and that she had simply been trying to help people nobody else cared about. She was sent to serve her sentence and remained there until her own passing in March 2011 at age 82. Until her final breath, she continued proclaiming her innocence, painting herself as a victim of circumstance rather than the architect of tragedy. The house on F Street still stands today, a Victorian structure that was once sold as a fixer-upper and later opened for tours, with proceeds going to organizations helping the very population Puente had preyed upon. One sign placed there by later owners reads, "It was the awful, awful woman that did it. Don't blame me." The house. Dorothea Puente's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how easily we can be deceived by appearances. She understood that society doesn't scrutinize grandmothers. She knew that vintage dresses and church attendance create a shield of respectability. Most disturbingly, she recognized that victims chosen from society's forgotten corners, the elderly without family, the homeless, the mentally ill, could vanish without anyone demanding answers. Her greatest weapon wasn't poison or strength. It was the trust we automatically place in someone who looks harmless. And that, perhaps, is the most disturbing lesson of all. Kelly Cochran. There's a darkness that exists in the space between love and obsession, between loyalty and possession. It's the kind of darkness that makes people do unthinkable things, not in a moment of rage, but with deliberate intention, over weeks, months, years. What happens when a marriage becomes a contract written in blood? When wedding vows transform into something so twisted that fidelity is measured not in faithfulness, but in body count? In the quiet communities of Michigan's Upper Peninsula and small-town Indiana, Kelly Cochran and her husband Jason made a pact on their wedding night in 2002, a promise that would eventually lead to at least 2 confirmed deaths and possibly many more. They agreed that if either of them ever had an affair, the unfaithful spouse would have to end the life of their lover or face being ended themselves. It sounds like the plot of a psychological thriller, but for Christopher Regan and Jason Cochran himself, it was terrifyingly real. Christopher Regan was a 51-year-old man living a quiet life in Iron River, Michigan, a small town in the Upper Peninsula where everyone knew everyone. He worked at Oldenburg Group, a local business, and seemed content with his simple existence. Then Kelly Cochran walked into his life. She was his co-worker, and despite being married to Jason, she began an affair with Chris that would consume them both. To the outside world, Kelly appeared to be living a double life with ease. She was married but acted single, carrying on her relationship with Chris openly enough that their co-workers noticed and began to gossip about the rumored romance. But what nobody understood was that every moment of passion between Kelly and Chris was pushing them closer to a deadly reckoning. On October 14th, 2014, Christopher Regan simply vanished. One day he was there, the next he was gone without a trace. His family reported him missing, but in a small town where people sometimes just leave to start over somewhere else, the disappearance didn't initially raise major alarms. That changed when Iron River Police Chief Laura Frizzo began digging into the case. Frizzo ran a tiny police force of just 4 officers, but her determination was immense. She quickly learned about Chris's affair with Kelly Cochran, and her instincts told her that Kelly and her husband Jason knew far more than they were saying. During questioning, Kelly admitted to the affair, but claimed she and Jason had an open marriage and that he was completely fine with her relationship with Chris. Jason's interview, however, told a completely different story. He was visibly upset about his wife's relationships with other men. The contradiction was glaring. In March 2015, Police searched the Cochran home looking for any clue about what might have happened to Chris Regan. They didn't find a body or physical traces, but they discovered something equally disturbing. A rough draft of a book written by Jason, in which he described going on violent sprees and seeking revenge against someone who bore a striking resemblance to Chris Regan. Shortly after the search, the Cochrans left Michigan and moved back to their home state of Indiana, settling in the town of Hobart. The case might have gone cold if not for what happened next. On February 20th, 2016, Kelly Cochran called 911 to report that her husband Jason wasn't breathing. When authorities arrived, they found him unresponsive in their Hobart home. An autopsy revealed he had been injected with a lethal dose of heroin and then suffocated. The coincidence was too stark to ignore. A woman whose lover disappeared under mysterious circumstances in Michigan now had a husband who passed under suspicious circumstances in Indiana. Detective Jeremy Ogden of the Hobart Police Department took on the case and employed psychological tactics that would eventually crack Kelly's carefully constructed walls. Ogden understood that Kelly needed to feel in control, so he kept all their interactions non-custodial, never making her feel trapped or cornered. He built a rapport with her over months, watching her patterns, studying her behavior. He noticed she frequently visited a specific park and would sit by a particular tree for long periods. Taking a calculated risk, Ogden carved the words, "Chris is here," into that tree, hoping to shake her psychologically. The tactic worked. That night, Kelly panicked, and in her fear, she began to tell Ogden everything, or at least her version of everything. Kelly claimed that on the night Chris Regan disappeared, Jason had forced her to invite Chris to their home. While she was with Chris, she said, Jason shot him in the head, fulfilling the dark pact they had made years earlier. She insisted Jason then made her help remove the bullet from Chris's skull and assist in taking apart his body. She led authorities to a remote location in Michigan's Upper Peninsula where they found Chris Regan's skull with a bullet hole in it, along with his eyeglasses. The teeth matched Chris's dental records, but investigators weren't convinced Kelly was being entirely truthful. As former police chief Frizzo put it, with Kelly it was constant deception punctuated by occasional truth. You had to figure out which was which. The story Kelly told about her husband's passing was equally calculated. She claimed she gave Jason the lethal injection of heroin and then smothered him because she was furious that he had taken away the only good thing she had in her life, her relationship with Chris Regan. It was revenge, she said. She was evening the score. But was that the whole truth? Or was Jason just the most convenient person to blame once he could no longer defend himself? In early 2017, Kelly Cochran went to trial for her role in Christopher Regan's death. She pleaded not guilty, with her defense arguing that Jason had acted alone out of jealousy. Kelly testified about what she claimed was years of mistreatment in her marriage. The prosecution challenged these assertions, presenting a different picture entirely, one of a woman who was not a victim, but an active participant in planning and carrying out violence. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury found Kelly Cochran responsible for Chris Regan's death. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rather than face a second trial for Jason's death, Kelly pleaded guilty in April 2018 and received an additional 65 years in prison. But the story didn't end there. While in custody, Kelly began making disturbing claims. She told authorities she and Jason might have committed other acts of violence. Her brother Colton told investigators he believed Kelly might be responsible for as many as 9 deaths, with bodies potentially hidden in Michigan, Indiana, Tennessee, and Minnesota. Neighbors from their time in Michigan claimed that shortly after Chris Regan disappeared, they heard the Cochrans using power tools late at night and were later invited to a barbecue where large amounts of meat were served. A claim that has never been proven but continues to haunt those who knew them. As part of her plea deal in Indiana, Kelly cannot be charged with additional crimes in that state if she provides locations of other potential victims. Yet despite this protection, she has never provided concrete information that has led to the discovery of other bodies. The trinket bag she allegedly kept with items from other victims was never found. Today, Kelly Cochran remains incarcerated at Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Ypsilanti, Michigan, serving life without parole plus 65 years. The question of whether there are other victims continues to haunt investigators like Laura Frizzo, who firmly believes the Chris Regan case was not Kelly's first time taking a life. The way the scene was cleaned, the lack of physical traces, the ease with which they disposed of remains, it all suggested a level of experience that shouldn't exist in a first-time offender. Kelly Cochran's case forces us to confront a disturbing reality, that sometimes the agreements people make in private, the pacts they seal behind closed doors, can turn a marriage into a death sentence for anyone unlucky enough to get caught in their web. Her story is a reminder that the most dangerous contracts are the ones nobody else knows exist. Betty Broderick. They promised each other forever when they were barely old enough to understand what forever meant. She put him through medical school and law school, raised their 4 children, hosted dinner parties for his colleagues, and built the perfect life in the perfect house in La Jolla, California. She played her part flawlessly in what she believed was a partnership, a team. But what do you do when the person you sacrificed everything for decides to rewrite the story without you in it? When the husband you supported becomes successful and suddenly you're no longer part of the plan? For Betty Broderick, the answer came in the early morning darkness of November 5, 1989, when she walked into a bedroom and fired 5 shots that would end 2 lives and destroy what remained of her own. Elizabeth Ann Broderick was born Elizabeth Ann Biseglia on November 7, 1947, and grew up in Bronxville, New York, in a large Catholic family where traditional values reigned. She met Daniel Broderick when they were both young, and they married when she was just 21 years old. What followed seemed like the American dream playing out exactly as it should. Betty worked multiple jobs to support Dan through medical school at Cornell and then Harvard Law School. She was the devoted wife, the one who kept everything together while he focused on building his career. They had 4 children together: Kim, Lee, Danny, and Rhett. And by the 1970s, when Dan landed a position at a prominent San Diego law firm specializing in medical malpractice, the family relocated west to California. By the mid-1970s, following years of financial struggles, the Brodericks were soon on the rise, settling into the affluent La Jolla neighborhood, joining country clubs, and becoming regulars on the city's social scene. They had the mansion, the boat, the country club memberships, the luxury cars. Dan was earning over $1 million a year. To everyone who saw them, they were living proof that hard work and dedication paid off. But Betty was beginning to feel the cracks forming. She claimed Dan spent little time with the family, that he disparaged her appearance and their home, that the man she had sacrificed so much for had become someone she barely recognized. In 1983, everything changed. Dan hired 21-year-old Linda Colkenna as his legal assistant, a former flight attendant with striking looks and an easy laugh. Betty's suspicions were immediate. She noticed the late nights at the office, the distance growing between them, the way Dan seemed to be pulling away from their marriage. On a trip to New York, Dan told Betty he didn't love her anymore. In fact, he said he hated her. Yet he didn't leave immediately, and he continued to deny any affair was happening. But Betty knew. She could feel it in every interaction, see it in every detail that didn't quite add up. By 1983, she suspected Dan was having an affair with Linda Colkenna, and her fears were confirmed when she went to surprise him at his office on his birthday and saw champagne bottles and apparent remnants of a party, with the receptionist telling her that Dan and Linda had been gone for most of the day. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Betty had experienced. This wasn't just about another woman. It was about everything she had invested, every sacrifice she had made, every promise they had made to each other. Dan finally moved out in February 1985 and filed for divorce. What followed was one of the most contentious and drawn-out divorce battles San Diego had ever witnessed. Betty alleged that Dan had also begun disparaging both her looks and the family's home, leading Betty to worry that he'd become despondent in the marriage. The proceedings lasted nearly 5 years, and during that time, Betty's behavior became increasingly erratic. She left vulgar messages on Dan's answering machine. She repeatedly vandalized the home she had once shared with her husband, even smearing a Boston cream pie that Linda had made all over Dan's clothes and belongings. She violated restraining orders. She showed up unannounced. Her children were caught in the middle, eventually going to live with their father. Betty believed Dan was using his legal expertise and connections to manipulate the divorce proceedings. She claimed he made it difficult for her to find adequate representation, that he controlled the finances, that he used the legal system as a weapon against her. Whether these claims were entirely accurate or the product of her deteriorating mental state became a matter of intense debate. What was clear was that Betty was spiraling, consumed by rage and a sense of injustice that grew with every court appearance, every legal maneuver, every reminder that the life she had built was being dismantled piece by piece. Dan got engaged to Linda Colcana in 1988 and married her on April 22, 1989. For Betty, watching Dan marry the woman she believed had destroyed her marriage was agony. She continued leaving messages on their answering machine. On November 3, 1989, Dan told Betty he'd file a legal complaint against her if she didn't stop leaving the messages. 2 days later, in the pre-dawn hours, Betty took action that would change everything. Using a key she had stolen from her daughter Kim, Betty entered Dan and Linda's home while they slept. She went upstairs to the master bedroom. The murders occurred at 5:30 a.m. On November 5, 1989, 2 days before Betty's 42nd birthday, she fired 5 shots from a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. 2 bullets hit Linda in the head and chest, ending her life instantly. 1 bullet hit Dan in the chest as he apparently was reaching for the phone. His final words were, "Okay, you shot me. I'm dead." Before she left the scene, Betty pulled the bedroom phone from the wall so that the couple could not call for help. She then fled and later turned herself in to police. The trials that followed became a media sensation. Betty's first trial in 1990 resulted in a hung jury, with some jurors sympathizing with her claims of psychological mistreatment, while others saw her as someone who had committed an act of pure revenge. At her second trial, which began in December 1991, prosecutors presented her as someone who had planned and executed a deliberate attack, playing the obscene messages she had left on the couple's answering machine as proof of her state of mind. The defense detailed Betty's troubled emotional state and argued she had suffered psychological distress throughout the divorce. Betty Broderick was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree homicide and later sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. Throughout both trials, Betty maintained that she had never intended for things to end the way they did, that she had only wanted to confront them, perhaps even take her own life in front of them. But the evidence suggested otherwise. She had purchased the weapon a month before the wedding. She had stolen the key. She had entered their home in the darkness and fired multiple times. Betty has been incarcerated since the day she committed the murders and is serving her sentence at the California Institution for Women in Chino, California. In January 2010, her first request for parole was denied by the Board of Parole Hearings because she neither showed remorse nor acknowledged wrongdoing. She was again denied parole in January 2017. She will not be eligible again until January 2032, at which date she will be 84 years old. The case of Betty Broderick continues to divide public opinion decades later. Some see her as a symbol of a woman pushed beyond her breaking point by a system that failed to protect her, a wife who gave everything only to be discarded when she was no longer convenient. Others see her as someone who let jealousy and rage consume her to the point where she destroyed lives, including her own. Her story has inspired television movies, documentary series, podcasts, an endless debate about marriage, divorce, betrayal, and the point at which victimhood ends and personal responsibility begins. Betty herself has never wavered in her belief that she was the wronged party, the one who suffered the greatest injustice. But 2 people are gone forever, 4 children lost both their father and their mother, and the question remains, when does pain become an excuse, and when does it simply become a reason? Stacey Castor. When 2 husbands pass away, people send sympathy cards. When both die under remarkably similar circumstances, people start asking questions. Stacey Castor understood this calculus perfectly, which is why she decided that when suspicion finally turned her way, the best defense wasn't to run or hide. It was to sacrifice her own daughter. In a story that redefined the limits of maternal betrayal, this woman from Clay, New York, didn't just take lives. She tried to arrange the perfect frame, complete with a confession letter, a staged scene, and a daughter who would have been too deceased to defend herself. The plan almost worked. Stacey Ruth Daniels was born in 1967 and grew up in upstate New York. By the time she reached adulthood, she seemed to have settled into a conventional life. She married Michael Wallace in 1990, and together they had 2 daughters, Ashley and Bree. Michael worked as a mechanic, and Stacey found employment as an ambulance dispatcher. Their schedules rarely overlapped. He worked evenings, she worked days. But from the outside, they appeared to be managing. Friends later recalled that the marriage had its tensions, particularly around Michael's struggles with substance use. But nothing that seemed extraordinary for a young family navigating financial pressures and conflicting work schedules. Then, in January 2000, Michael Wallace became ill. He complained of problems with his balance, difficulty walking, and severe nausea. He sought medical attention, and doctors suggested he might have an inner ear disorder. The symptoms persisted through the holidays and into the new year. One evening, Michael sat up on the sofa, became violently sick, and then lay back down as though nothing had happened. Shortly afterward, he was found unresponsive in the family home. He was only 38 years old. At the hospital, doctors pronounced him deceased, and Stacey told them he had a history of heart problems. Based on this information and the apparent naturalness of the death, no autopsy was performed. Michael Wallace was laid to rest, leaving behind his widow and 2 young daughters. Nobody questioned what had really happened. Stacey moved forward with her life. By 2003, she had met David Castor, a successful businessman who owned his own firm. They married, and for a while, everything seemed to be falling into place. David's business was thriving, generating over $1 million annually, and the couple bought a home together in Clay. Stacey's daughters adjusted to having a stepfather. But by 2005, those closest to David noticed changes. He complained about feeling unwell. He seemed distant. Then, on August 22nd, 2005, Stacey called 911 in apparent distress. She told the dispatcher that her husband had locked himself in their bedroom for an entire day and wouldn't respond. When officers arrived and forced open the door, they found David Castor deceased in the couple's bed, which was covered in vomit. Next to him sat a glass filled with green liquid, and on the floor, partially under the bed, was a container of antifreeze. The scene appeared to be a straightforward case of self-harm by poisoning. There was no note, but authorities initially accepted the explanation that David Castor had taken his own life. Stacy arranged for him to be buried in a plot directly next to Michael Wallace's grave, a detail she specifically requested. She appeared to be a woman marked by extraordinary misfortune, having lost 2 husbands under different but equally sorrowful circumstances. But to investigators, something about the death didn't sit right. David's fingerprints weren't on the glass. There were inconsistencies in the scene, and when they looked deeper into Stacy's history, they discovered the unusual timing of her first husband's passing. Authorities made the decision to exhume Michael Wallace's body in secret during September 2007. They monitored Stacy's movements to ensure she wouldn't discover what they were doing. When the autopsy results came back, they confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. Michael Wallace had been poisoned with ethylene glycol, the toxic component in antifreeze. The same substance that ended David Castor's life had also ended Michael Wallace's. The pattern was undeniable. Stacy Castor hadn't just lost 2 husbands. She had eliminated them using the exact same method, separated by 5 years. But Stacy wasn't finished. When word began to circulate that Michael's body had been exhumed and that investigators were closing in, she devised a plan that would shift all blame away from herself. The target was her own daughter, Ashley, who was 20 years old at the time. Over 2 consecutive nights, Stacy suggested they spend time together drinking, an offer that seemed unusual but not necessarily suspicious to a young woman whose mother rarely made such gestures. Ashley later recalled thinking it was oddly generous that her mother was giving her permission to drink at home. What Ashley didn't know was that the beverages Stacy prepared were laced with a lethal combination of prescription medications. After the first night, Ashley passed out and woke up in her bedroom with no memory of how she got there. The second night, the same thing happened, but this time, she didn't wake up. Her younger sister Bree found her the next morning, completely unresponsive, with what appeared to be a typed confession letter on her nightstand. The note, more than 750 words long, rambled without punctuation and claimed that Ashley had ended the lives of both her father and stepfather. It read like a daughter's anguished admission of guilt, complete with pleas for forgiveness. Ashley was rushed to the hospital, where doctors later said she arrived within minutes of passing away. When she regained consciousness, a detective informed her about the note. Ashley was bewildered. She insisted she hadn't written anything, hadn't harmed anyone, and had no idea what they were talking about. Computer forensics specialists examined the family computer and discovered that the note had been typed on Stacy's user account. Even more telling, they found multiple drafts of the letter, showing that Stacy had refined her daughter's supposed confession over time. One particularly damning detail emerged. The note spelled antifreeze as antifree, the exact pronunciation Stacy had used during her own police interviews. The case against Stacy Castor was built on a combination of forensic analysis, physical traces, and her own mistakes. Investigators found a turkey baster in the kitchen garbage that contained both David Castor's DNA and residue from antifreeze, suggesting he had been force-fed the poison when he became too weak to resist. Stacy's fingerprints were the only ones on the glass found beside David's body. The exhumation of Michael Wallace revealed the same poisoning method, and the attempted framing of Ashley, complete with a forged confession, demonstrated a willingness to destroy her own child to avoid accountability. The trial began in January 2009 and became a media sensation. Prosecutors laid out their case methodically, presenting forensic linguistic analysis, computer records showing the drafts of the fake note, and testimony from Ashley herself, who sat on the stand and confronted her mother. Stacy maintained her innocence throughout, insisting that she had not harmed either husband and had not tried to end her daughter's life. Her defense attorney suggested that Ashley might have been responsible, though this argument crumbled under the weight of physical proof and timeline analysis. On February 5, 2009, after 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their decision. Stacy Castor was found responsible for the second-degree ending of David Castor's life and for the attempted second-degree ending of Ashley's life. She was also found guilty of forging David Castor's will. At sentencing, the judge described her actions as beyond comprehension, noting that attempting to sacrifice one's own child to avoid consequences represented a level of darkness rarely seen in any courtroom. Stacy received 51 years to life in prison. She served 7 years before passing away from a heart attack in her cell on June 11, 2016. She was 48 years old. Authorities confirmed there was no foul play involved in her passing. Stacy Castor never admitted guilt, never showed remorse, and never provided answers to the many questions that lingered about her motivations. Her mother continued to insist on her innocence and even suggested that Ashley was the true perpetrator, a claim that has been universally rejected by those familiar with the case. The story of Stacy Castor remains one of the most disturbing examples of how trust within a family can be weaponized. She didn't just take lives, she did it slowly, deliberately, using a method that mimicked natural illness and self-harm. And when caught, she demonstrated a willingness to destroy her daughter's life to save her own. The case changed how investigators approach suspicious deaths, particularly when patterns emerge across multiple family members. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers in the darkness, but from the people who pour your drinks and tuck you into bed at night. Brenda Andrew. In a courtroom, justice is supposed to be blind. The focus should be on what happened, the evidence that proves it, and the law that applies to it. But what happens when a trial becomes less about the crime and more about who the defendant wore to dinner with? What if the prosecution spends more time discussing lingerie than motive? In 2004, a woman in Oklahoma was sentenced to die not purely for what she had done, but for who prosecutors convinced a jury she was. Her name is Brenda Andrew, and she remains the only woman on death row in Oklahoma, trapped in a case that has divided judges, sparked Supreme Court intervention, and raised profound questions about how gender shapes the ultimate punishment. Brenda was born and raised in Enid, Oklahoma, to a middle-class family of devout Christians. Those who knew her as a child described her as quiet, dedicated to her church, and focused on helping others. She earned good grades and seemed destined for a conventional life. At 21, she married Rob Andrew, and when Rob took a job in Texas, she moved with him. Eventually, they returned to Oklahoma, where Brenda became a Sunday school teacher and stay-at-home mother following the birth of their 2 children. Friends and family consistently noted her wonderful relationship with her kids, describing her as kind, gentle, and always willing to make time for them. But beneath the surface of that conventional life, cracks were forming. The marriage was struggling. By 2001, Brenda and Rob were separated and moving toward divorce. Rob had taken out an $800,000 insurance policy through an insurance salesman named James Parvat, who had become a friend. What nobody realized at the time was that Parvat and Brenda had also become involved in a relationship that would soon intersect with catastrophe. On November 20th, 2001, Rob Andrew went to the house he had once shared with Brenda to pick up their children for Thanksgiving. What happened next would forever alter multiple lives. Rob was shot multiple times in the garage and later succumbed to his injuries. Brenda claimed that 2 armed, masked men had burst in, attacked Rob, and even grazed her arm before fleeing. She described herself as a terrified witness to a random act of violence, a version of events that positioned her as a victim alongside her estranged husband. But investigators weren't convinced. The story had inconsistencies. The wound on Brenda's arm appeared superficial and perhaps self-inflicted. Her behavior after the incident raised questions. Shortly after Rob's passing, Brenda and Parvat fled with her children toward Mexico, an action that seemed more like escape than grief. They were arrested at the border before they could cross. James Pavat eventually confessed to the shooting, but he claimed he had acted with a friend and insisted that Brenda had not been involved. The state, however, pursued a different theory, that Brenda had conspired with Pavat to eliminate Rob Andrew and collect on his substantial insurance policy. Pavat was tried first, and a jury sentenced him to death. When Brenda's trial began in 2004, the prosecution had a circumstantial case built largely on motive and opportunity rather than direct proof. They needed to convince a jury that this Sunday school teacher and devoted mother was capable of planning and carrying out such an act. And so they made a decision that would define the trial and spark decades of legal controversy. They focused not on the strength of their evidence, but on destroying Brenda's character as a woman. What followed was a trial unlike any other. Prosecutors called witnesses to testify about Brenda's relationships going back nearly 2 decades. They asked detailed questions about where and how often she had relations with men in cars and motel rooms. They displayed her underwear in front of the jury, holding up a thong and asking whether a grieving widow would pack such items. They paraded witnesses who described her clothing as too tight, too short, too revealing. They referred to her as a hoochie and a slut puppy. They questioned whether a good mother would behave the way Brenda had, suggesting that her failings as a wife and woman made her capable of ending a life. The strategy worked. The jury returned with a guilty decision and sentenced Brenda Andrew to death. But several judges who reviewed the case later expressed deep concern about what had happened in that courtroom. Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals Judge Arlene Johnson wrote in her dissent that the trial was designed to hammer home that Brenda Andrew is a bad wife, a bad mother, and a bad woman, and that such evidence served no legitimate purpose in determining her guilt or innocence. Federal Judge Robert Bacharach later agreed, writing that the prosecution had portrayed Brenda as a scarlet woman, a modern Jezebel, and that focusing so intensely on her personal life plucked away any realistic chance that the jury would seriously consider her version of events. The case wound its way through appeals for 2 decades. In 2023, a federal appeals court upheld her conviction and sentence in a 2-to-1 decision, with the dissenting judge arguing that the trial had been fundamentally unfair. Brenda's legal team continued fighting, and in January 2025, the United States Supreme Court issued a rare, unsigned opinion that acknowledged prosecutors had spent significant time at trial, focusing on irrelevant details about Brenda's sex life, clothing choices, and behavior as a wife and mother. The court ordered lower courts to reconsider whether this evidence had deprived her of a fair trial. As of today, at 61 years old, Brenda Andrew remains on death row at the Mabel Bassett Correctional Center in Oklahoma, the only woman awaiting execution in the state. Her case continues to be reviewed by federal judges who must now decide whether the focus on her personal life crossed a constitutional line. Meanwhile, James Pavat, the man who confessed to the shooting and was also sentenced to death, has exhausted his appeals and faces execution. The questions raised by Brenda Andrews' case extend far beyond one woman's guilt or innocence. They force us to confront how gender stereotypes infiltrate the justice system, particularly in cases where the stakes are life and death. Would a male defendant have faced questions about his underwear, his clothing choices at the grocery store, or his relationships from 20 years earlier? Would prosecutors have spent their closing arguments moralizing about his failings as a husband and father? The answer, in nearly every comparable case, is no. Whether Brenda Andrew conspired to end her husband's life remains a matter of legal record. She maintains her innocence to this day, insisting that she was not involved in the planning or execution of the crime. But what cannot be disputed is that her trial became less about evidence and more about morality, less about what she did and more about who she was perceived to be. In a justice system that promises fairness regardless of gender, her case stands as a reminder of how far we still have to go. The courtroom may claim to be blind, but in Brenda Andrews' trial, it saw everything except what truly mattered. Aileen Wuornos. America's highways are supposed to represent freedom, the open road, the promise of escape, the possibility of starting over somewhere new. But what happens when those same highways become hunting grounds? When the hitchhiker with her thumb out isn't looking for a ride to the next town, but for her next victim? Between 1989 and 1990, along the sun-baked interstates of Central Florida, 7 men stopped to pick up a woman they believed needed help. None of them would make it home. Aileen Wuornos became the first woman to fit the FBI's definition of a serial killer. Someone who targeted strangers, allowed time between attacks, and operated with a pattern that mirrored the most notorious male killers in American history. Her story would inspire Academy Award-winning films, countless documentaries, and decades of debate about whether she was a damaged soul fighting back or simply someone who discovered she enjoyed taking lives. Aileen Carol Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. From the very beginning, her life was marked by abandonment and violence. Her father was sentenced in 1967 to life imprisonment for attacking and ending the life of a 7-year-old girl. He later took his own life in prison. Her mother was just 16 when Aileen was born, having married at 14. When Aileen was still a young child, her mother left, and she and her brother were sent to live with their grandparents. What should have been a refuge became another chapter of hardship. By age 11, Aileen was trading certain favors at her elementary school for cigarettes and other items. Her teenage years brought pregnancy, dropping out of school, and a life spent moving between the streets, motels, and temporary shelters. At 20 years old, Aileen tried to escape by hitchhiking to Florida and marrying 69-year-old Louis Fell, a successful businessman and yacht club president. The marriage lasted just 9 weeks. Aileen frequently left their home to spend time at local bars where she got into fights, and she also became physically aggressive toward Fell, who eventually obtained a restraining order. The annulment forced her back into the transient existence she had been trying to leave behind. By the mid-1980s, she was back in Florida, surviving through a combination of odd jobs, theft, and working the highways. In June 1986, now going by Lee, Aileen met 24-year-old Tyria Moore at a bar in Daytona. The two women began an intense relationship and moved in together. While Moore worked as a housekeeper or maid, Aileen continued working along Florida's highways. They moved frequently between motels, apartments, and mobile homes. For a brief time, it seemed like Aileen had found something resembling stability, but beneath the surface, something darker was building. In 1989, she took the life of her first known victim, 51-year-old Richard Mallory, who had picked her up along a Florida highway. Aileen later claimed that Mallory grew aggressive during their encounter and that she acted to protect herself. His body was found with multiple wounds. Over the next year, at least 6 more middle-aged men were found deceased along the highways of Florida and southern Georgia. The victims included David Spears, a 43-year-old construction worker, Charles Carskadden, age 40, Dick Humphreys, a retired Air Force major and police chief, Peter Seams, 65, whose body was never recovered, and Walter Antonio, 62. All had been shot multiple times. Their vehicles were stolen, and their bodies were left in wooded areas off the highways. Aileen and Moore would occasionally sell items taken from the victims at local pawn shops. In July 1990, Aileen and Moore crashed the car belonging to Peter Seams. Witnesses provided descriptions of the two women, and composite sketches were circulated. Law enforcement was able to match crime scene fingerprints with Eileen's prints, which were readily available due to her lengthy record of previous offenses. The net was closing. In January 1991, Eileen was arrested at the Last Resort Biker Bar in Volusia County while Moore was in Pennsylvania. When Moore was returned to Florida, authorities convinced her to cooperate in exchange for immunity. Over recorded phone calls, Eileen admitted to the actions, claiming the men had tried to harm her and she had defended herself. But as the case moved forward, inconsistencies emerged. Why had she robbed them? Why had she taken their cars? If it was truly self-defense, why hadn't she reported any of the incidents to authorities? On January 27, 1992, Eileen was found responsible for Richard Mallory's ending, and 4 days later, she received a sentence of death. She later pleaded no contest to 5 additional cases. Throughout the proceedings, she maintained her claims of self-defense, insisting each man had become aggressive and she had no choice. Crucially, it was later revealed that Richard Mallory had a prior conviction related to a similar offense against a woman, information that wasn't presented during her trial. Some argued this supported her version of events, at least for the first incident. But the pattern that followed, 7 men in just over a year, all robbed, all left in similar circumstances, suggested something more than repeated acts of self-preservation. As her execution date approached, Eileen changed her story, confessing that she had intentionally killed for profit. She stated, "I killed those men, robbed them as cold as ice. And I'd do it again, too. There's no chance in keeping me alive or anything, because I'd kill again. I have hate crawling through my system." Whether this admission was the truth finally emerging or the words of someone who had given up hope and wanted the process to end remains a matter of interpretation. Eileen fired her attorneys and dropped her appeals, despite lingering questions about her mental state. Mental health experts who evaluated her diagnosed conditions, including borderline personality disorder and antisocial tendencies, though these were complicated by her documented history of severe childhood trauma. The question facing the courts wasn't whether she had committed the acts, she had admitted to them, but whether she had been capable of understanding right from wrong at the time, and whether her troubled past should have factored more heavily into her sentencing. On October 9, 2002, at 9:47 in the morning, Eileen Wuornos was put to death by injection at Florida State Prison. She was 46 years old. Her last words were, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." She was the 10th woman put to death in the United States since capital punishment was reinstated in 1976. Following her passing, her ashes were scattered beneath a tree in Michigan by a childhood friend. The case of Eileen Wuornos continues to divide opinion more than 2 decades after her execution. Documentaries, academic papers, and endless public debate have examined whether the justice system adequately considered her lifetime of trauma when determining her fate. Feminist criminologists have argued that the unique dangers and experiences faced by women in her position weren't properly acknowledged, particularly regarding her right to defend herself against male aggression. Others point to the pattern of her actions, the robbery, the theft of vehicles, the targeting of vulnerable strangers, as proof that her motives extended far beyond self-preservation. Her story inspired the film Monster in 2003, starring Charlize Theron in an Oscar-winning performance, along with numerous other documentaries and dramatizations. Each retelling grapples with the same central question. Was Eileen Wuornos a deeply damaged woman who finally fought back against a world that had abused her from childhood? Or was she someone who discovered that taking lives was easier than facing the consequences of her choices? The answer, like so much about her life, remains somewhere in the uncomfortable space between victim and perpetrator, a space that challenges our understanding of justice, punishment, and the limits of human compassion. Amy Bishop. Academic success is supposed to open doors. A Harvard education, advanced degrees, years of research, these are the building blocks of a respected career, the markers of someone who has dedicated their life to knowledge and discovery. But what happens when that career hits an immovable wall? When rejection arrives in the form of a tenure denial, and suddenly the future you spent decades building disappears. For most people, it means dusting off a resume and starting over. For Amy Bishop, a 44-year-old biology professor at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, it meant something far darker. On February 12, 2010, she sat through 30 minutes of an ordinary faculty meeting before pulling a handgun from her purse and targeting her colleagues, one by one in a manner witnesses described as eerily calm and deliberate. 3 people would not leave that conference room alive. 3 others barely survived. And in the aftermath, investigators would uncover a disturbing history that stretched back 24 years to another shooting that had been buried and forgotten. Amy Bishop was born in 1965 and grew up in Braintree, Massachusetts. She was academically gifted from an early age, eventually earning admission to Northeastern University and later Harvard, where she completed her doctorate in genetics. She married James Anderson, and together they built what appeared to be a stable family life with 4 children. By all outward measures, Bishop had achieved the dream: advanced education, a university teaching position, and a career in scientific research. But those who worked closely with her began noticing cracks in that polished exterior. Colleagues described her as difficult, prone to outbursts, and increasingly unstable. Students complained about her teaching style. In 2002, she had an incident at a restaurant where she confronted another customer over a booster seat, and when refused, punched the woman in the head while shouting, "I am Dr. Amy Bishop." She was charged with assault, received probation, and was supposed to attend anger management classes. Her husband later admitted she never went. By 2003, Bishop had joined the biology department at the University of Alabama in Huntsville as an assistant professor. For 6 years, she worked toward the goal that defines academic careers: tenure. Tenure means permanent employment, job security, and recognition that you have earned your place in the institution. In March 2009, Bishop applied for tenure. The university denied her application. She appealed repeatedly throughout 2009, but each appeal was rejected. Under university policy, spring 2010 would be her last semester. She would have to leave, find another position, start over elsewhere. For someone who had spent her entire adult life climbing the academic ladder, this was more than a professional setback. It was, in her mind, the end of everything. On the day of the shooting, Bishop taught her anatomy and neurosciences class at the university. A student later said Bishop seemed perfectly normal during the lecture. That afternoon, she attended a routine biology department faculty meeting on the 3rd floor of the Shelby Center for Science and Technology. Approximately 12 people were present. Bishop sat quietly at the meeting for 30 to 40 minutes before pulling out a Ruger P95 9mm handgun just before 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Associate Professor Joseph Ng, who survived, later described what happened. She got up suddenly, took out a gun, and started shooting at each one of us. She started with the one closest to her and went down the row, shooting her targets in the head. Another survivor said, "This wasn't random shooting around the room. This was execution style." The victims were Bishop's boss and colleagues. The gunfire ended the lives of biology department chairman Gopi Podala, plus professors Maria Ragland Davis and Adriel Johnson, professors Joseph Leahy, staff aide Stephanie Monticello, and assistant professor Luis Cruz Vera were shot and wounded. The shooting only stopped when Bishop's gun jammed. Survivors were able to push her out of the room and barricade the door. Bishop was arrested shortly afterward on campus. When police searched her belongings, they found her computer, the family minivan, and a large binder containing documents about her 10-year battle. The case took an even more disturbing turn on June 16, 2010, when Amy Bishop was charged with ending the life of her brother nearly 24 years earlier. In December 1986, when Bishop was 21 years old, she had shot and ended the life of her 18-year-old brother Seth in their family home in Braintree. At the time, she claimed she was trying to unload her father's shotgun and it accidentally discharged. Local police had ruled it an accident. But when investigators in Alabama began examining Bishop's background, Massachusetts authorities reopened the case. New details emerged, including an incident immediately after Seth's passing when a wild-eyed Bishop burst into a car dealership, pointed the shotgun at employees, and demanded a getaway car, claiming she had a fight with her husband. The story she had told about an accident began to unravel. Massachusetts District Attorney William Keating later admitted, "I can't give you any explanations. I can't give you excuses because there are none. Jobs weren't done, responsibilities weren't met, and justice wasn't served." Bishop was charged with 1 count of capital murder and 3 counts of attempted murder for the Huntsville shootings. She initially pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, with her attorneys arguing she had mental health issues. On September 11, 2012, she changed her plea to guilty after family members of victims petitioned the judge against use of the death penalty. On September 24, 2012, Bishop was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Massachusetts charges related to her brother's passing were eventually dropped since she was already serving life. In 2015, 5 years after the shooting, Bishop issued her first apology in a 50-page court filing, calling it a terrible crime and saying she was terribly sorry for the victims and their families, and my family. But she continued filing appeals, claiming she was mentally ill when she entered her guilty plea and that her lawyers had been inadequate. One of the surviving victims, Joseph Leahy, who was shot in the head and is now blind in one eye, rejected her apology, stating, "Dr. Bishop has ceased to exist in my world. She just doesn't exist anymore. Do I think she's truly sorry? I think she truly wants to get out of prison. That's what I think." Today, at 55 years old, Amy Bishop remains incarcerated at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Wetumpka, Alabama, where she will spend the rest of her life. Her husband James stated they remain married for financial reasons. It's cheaper, and that they rarely visit her in prison. Their 4 children are now adults. In a particularly sorrowful twist, on April 18, 2021, Bishop's 20-year-old son Seth Anderson, named after her late brother, was fatally shot in an unrelated incident in Huntsville. The violence that had defined Amy Bishop's life had circled back to claim another generation. The conference room where the shootings occurred has been converted to office space, and a new conference room across the hall is now surrounded by glass, allowing visibility in and out. A living garden along the university's greenway serves as a memorial to the 3 professors who lost their lives. The University of Alabama in Huntsville now performs background checks on all faculty hires, though officials acknowledge that routine checks likely wouldn't have revealed Bishop's past since the 1986 shooting had been ruled accidental and sealed. The case of Amy Bishop forces uncomfortable questions about how academic institutions handle rejection, mental health, and warning signs. It has been documented that a colleague openly described her as being crazy, and students petitioned to have her removed from the classroom, yet she remained in her position until tenure was denied. Survivor Deborah Moriarty, who is now biology chairman at the school, reflected, "As the years go by, I'm seeing it less as a crime and more as a disease. But for the families of Gopi Podila, Maria Ragland Davis, and Adriel Johnson, and for the survivors who carry physical and psychological wounds to this day, Amy Bishop's actions were both a crime and a choice, one that ended lives, destroyed families, and left a university community forever changed.